The deed felt heavier than it should in Dern Ashvale's calloused hands as he stared at the farm that was supposed to be empty. 3 orc women stood on the porch like sentinels, their imposing silhouettes casting long green shadows. The tallest stepped forward with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You must be the new owner." The sun was dying behind the canyon of green shadows when Dern Ashvale finally spotted the farm. 3 days of riding through dry, cracked earth had left his bones heavy and his throat tasting of red dust. His horse snorted, exhausted, as it climbed the last hill before the property. Dern adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and took a slow breath. It was supposed to be empty. That was what the man called Vance had promised. A well-situated farm, fertile soil, spring water, no occupants. Dern had handed over every coin he had, 5 years of savings from bounty hunting along the northern borders. This was his chance to stop, to live. But the farm was not empty. 3 figures stood out on the dark wooden porch, tall, broad in the shoulders. Their skin carried the intense, vivid green that Dern had only seen on orc warriors from the mountain clans. Not the greyish green of the plains half-bloods, but the deep green of those who carried old blood. Pointed ears caught the wind. Small, discreet tusks gleamed in the last thread of daylight. Dern slowed his horse. His hand dropped instinctively to the grip of his revolver before he forced himself to let go. 3 adult orc women. He wasn't stupid. The tallest stepped forward. She was as tall as a young fir tree, with dark braids held by rings of bone painted red. Her eyes were amber, warm and cold at the same time, like embers covered in ash. The smile that appeared on her face never reached those eyes. "You must be the new owner," she said. Her voice came out low and precise, like a drum struck once. Dern stopped his horse 10 meters from the porch. "How do you know my name?" She didn't answer. She simply tilted her head, as if the question were too obvious to deserve a response. The other 2 stayed where they were. One was smaller, by orc standards, which still meant a full head above Dern, with brown eyes and hands stained with earth. The other had hair that was an unusual red among the green people, tied in a thick braid, and carried a heavy book under her arm, like a weapon. "Come down," said the tall one. "There's a great deal to discuss." Dern didn't dismount immediately. His eyes swept the farm. The fence was in good shape. The barn looked solid. There was light coming from inside the main house, a fire burning, the smell of cooked meat in the air. Someone had cared for that place with attention, a great deal of attention. Then he saw something that made him blink twice. In the doorframe of the house, hanging by a leather cord, was an amulet made of dark green crystal. It turned slowly, with no wind to move it. Dern felt the back of his neck prickle. He had seen that kind of amulet before, once, years ago, in a place he tried not to remember. "Problem?" asked the orc with red hair, her brown eyes fixed on him. "None," said Dern. He dismounted. As he tied the reins to the entry post, he heard the porch boards creak under the weight of the 3 women. He felt their gazes on his back with physical precision, like fingers pressing between his shoulder blades. The tall one spoke again, still without giving her name. "Welcome to Greenbone Farm, Dern Ashvale. You'll want to hear what we have to say before you make any decisions." Dern turned to face them. "I have the deed to this property." "I know," she said. "The problem is what's written in it." The main room of the house smelled of dried herbs and pine smoke. Bundles of unfamiliar plants hung from the ceiling, some with wilted purple flowers, others with roots still carrying soil. Dern sat in the only available chair, a sturdy oak piece with a worn seat. The 3 orc women remained standing, not for lack of space, by choice. The tall one finally gave her name. "Helena," she pointed to the red-haired one. "Ruth," then to the smaller one. "Magdalene." Dern gave a nod of acknowledgement. He still held the deed in his hand. The paper felt damp, though there was no reason for it. "You bought this farm from Marcus Vance," said Helena. It was not a question. "I did," confirmed Dern. "Vance had no right to sell without honoring what he promised us." Helena's voice did not rise. That made it worse. Each word landed with calculated weight. "He lived here for nearly a year. He promised partnership. He promised he would stay." Ruth opened the heavy book to a page marked with a dry branch. "And before he ran off with the money," she said, her voice sharper, with a thread of barely contained anger, "he signed this." She placed the book on the table. It was a contract, 3 pages of dense language, with a human notary seal on the last page, the kind with red wax and an embossed mark. Marcus Vance's signature was there, crooked but legible. Dern leaned forward and read. It took time. The fire crackled. None of the 3 spoke while he read. The document was an agricultural partnership with carefully vague language in certain sections. Mutual support appeared 3 times. Long-term companionship appeared twice. But there were also concrete clauses: profit-sharing, liability for debts, transfer of obligations to the next legal holder of the property, to the next legal holder. Dern closed the book slowly. "This was made to trap me." "Ooh, made to trap Vance," Magdalene corrected, crossing her arms. "He chose to pass the bill along." "And you accept that?" Dern looked at each of them. "Putting me in this position without even knowing me?" Helena met his gaze without blinking. "We lost a year of work, of trust and of hope because of a man who smiled while he lied. Now we have a legal contract and a new owner of the property. We use what we have." There was something in her voice that was not just anger. It was something older, more tired. Dern stood and walked to the window. Outside, the full moon lit the fields. Even at night it was clear. The fences were perfect. The orchard on the east side was organized in precise rows. There was a system of earthen channels he hadn't noticed on arrival. Someone had worked very hard on that place, very hard. "You did all of this?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the field. "Yes," said Ruth. "Did Marcus help?" A pause. Then, "Marcus watched," said Magdalene, dry. Dern kept looking at the fields for a moment longer. The crystal amulet in the doorframe kept turning, now caught by the night breeze. He had promised himself he wouldn't think about that matter. The last time he had seen a crystal like that, in that southern town, in that bad winter. But the memory came back anyway. Fast and cold, like waterfall water, he pushed it back down. Now was not the time. "Then explain it to me," he said, turning to face the 3. "All of it, from the beginning." Helena studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, her smile reached her eyes, just a little, just for a second. "Sit down," she said. "It will take a while." Helena began to speak, and the fire slowly died down to embers. Marcus Vance had arrived at Greenbone Farm at the end of the dry season, with a thin horse and a well-rehearsed story. He was human, like Dern, but the kind who learns early to use charm where muscle is lacking. He said he wanted a fresh start, wanted to work honestly, to build something real. The 3 Orc women who had bought that land 2 years earlier with gold earned through a full winter of hunting in the north had opened their doors. "I was the first to let him in," admitted Helena, now seated on the bench against the wall, hands open on her knees. "He seemed sincere." Ruth made a short sound in her throat. "Seemed." Vance stayed. He helped where help was needed, but never more than enough to be held accountable later. He learned the names of the irrigation channels that Ruth had designed and began presenting them as his own to passing merchants who asked questions. He learned the trade routes that Magdalene had established with the 3 surrounding settlements and started running them as if he owned the relationships. "We saw it," said Magdalene, "but the contract wasn't ready yet. We waited too long." When the contract was finally ready, drafted by a human notary that Magdalene had spent 3 days tracking down, Vance signed without hesitation, smiling, as if it were a minor detail. 2 weeks later, he had vanished. He took the horse, the savings stored in the barn as a fund for suppliers, and the promise to return in a few days to close some business. He never came back. Dern listened without interrupting. He had learned in years of hunting fugitives that the right silence draws out more than any question. "How long ago was that?" he asked when Helena finished. 4 months, said Ruth, and you stayed waiting. We stayed working, Magdalene corrected firmly. Waiting is different from stopping. Dern looked at their hands. All 3 showed marks of heavy labor, calluses on the palms, earth stains beneath the nails, small scars on their knuckles. These were not the hands of women who had spent 4 months standing still. "The contract says the next owner inherits the obligations," he said, more to himself than to them. "Vance knew what he was doing when he sold me the deed." "Yes," said Helena. "So I'm your revenge." Silence. "Or your second chance," said Ruth, so quietly it was almost impossible to hear. Dern stood and walked to the door. The crystal turned. He stood looking at it longer than he should have, feeling that familiar strangeness, the sensation of having been here before, of having seen this scene from a different angle, in a different light. Déjà vu people in the cities called it. The Orc clans of the north called it something else. They called it a borrowed memory, when an ancient spirit pushed a piece of its past into a living person as a warning. Dern was not an Orc, but he had spent enough time on the frontiers to not dismiss such things. "Tomorrow," he said without turning. "Tomorrow you show me the farm, all of it, in detail." None of them answered immediately. It was Helena who spoke in the end. "That's fine." Dern climbed the stairs to the room they had left prepared, as if they had known he would stay, and lay down with the deed on his chest. The ceiling creaked softly in the wind. He took a long time to fall asleep. Morning arrived with the smell of strong coffee and cornbread baking. Dern came downstairs to find the 3 already awake and booted, as if they had never slept, or as if their day began before the sun had an opinion. Ruth was on the porch, with a roll of paper open on the wooden railing, weighing down the corners with small stones so the wind wouldn't take it. She called Dern over with a direct gesture, no formalities. The paper was a map of the farm, but not a simple map. It was precise, with elevation markings, dominant wind direction, estimated groundwater depth at 3 points, and a network of blue lines forming a channel system with strategic diversions for the dry and rainy seasons. "You made this?" asked Dern. "In 6 weeks," said Ruth, "alone, while Vance was traveling on business that didn't exist. The irrigation system was remarkable. It captured water from a spring at the highest point of the property, distributed it by gravity across 3 different levels, and had a diversion gate that could be operated by 1 person alone, even during heavy floods. Dern had seen human engineers hired by large eastern landowners attempt to build something similar and fail. Ruth explained every detail with patience and precision, pointing at the map and then at the actual terrain, walking ahead of Dern along the channels with long, steady strides. She didn't use many words, but the ones she used were exact. Dern noticed she measured information carefully, giving enough to impress, but also enough to be understood. Then it was Magdalene's turn. She led Dern to the barn where she kept her records, a system of notebooks organized by settlement, by product, and by season. 3 communities bought from Greenbone Farm regularly, grain for the mining village to the east, meat and leather for the frontier post to the north, medicinal herbs for an Orc healer who lived 2 days' ride to the west. "I established each route personally," said Magdalene, running her fingers along the spines of the notebooks. "Every agreement was negotiated by me. Not one of Vance's signatures on any of these contracts. "So, the contracts are yours," said Dern. "Always were." There was something sharp in the way she said it. Not anger. Something more like defensive pride, the kind that grows when a person realizes what they have can be taken away at any moment. By late afternoon, Helena led him to the cattle field. The animals were healthy, well-fed, with clean clan markings on their hides. Helena moved among them with quiet familiarity, touching flanks, checking teeth, adjusting pasture fencing with quick, economical movements. "You care about them," Dern observed. "They do their work without complaining," said Helena. "I learned to respect that." It was the first moment her stiffness had broken, even if only for a second. There was dry humor in there, buried deep, the kind that survives difficult things. Dern looked out at the fields leading back to the house. The farm was good, more than good. It was the kind of property a man could spend a lifetime trying to build and manage, with luck in 2 generations. These 3 had done it in 2 years. Vance didn't deserve to set foot here, he said without thinking. Helena stopped walking. She stood with her back to him for a moment, then turned slowly. The amber eyes were different, less calculated, more human, more orc, perhaps, in the truest sense of the word. "No," she said. He didn't. Dern went quiet. The sun sank behind the hills. Somewhere in the field, one of the bulls made a low, slow sound. The farm waited. The rain came on the 5th night. Dern woke to the sound of it on the roof, a strong, irregular rhythm, like hooves on a stone floor. He came downstairs to find Helena already in the kitchen, a candle lit and the account book open on the table. She didn't look up when he entered. "Couldn't sleep." "The rain," he said. "A gentle lie," she replied. Then she pushed the book toward him. "You need to see this anyway." Dern sat down. The candle lit the pages with an uneven amber light. It took time to understand what he was seeing, not because the numbers were difficult, but because what they said was worse than he had expected. Marcus Vance had taken on debts in the names of the 3 orc women. Not one debt, several. Seed suppliers, a blacksmith from the town of Redsong, a leather merchant 40 leagues away, an intermediary who supplied salt and spices from the south. The debts had names, values, and dates. Most were due within 3 to 4 weeks. "He did this in your names?" Dern checked. "With our clan seals," said Helena. Her voice was calm, but there was a tight line in her neck that he had learned to identify as contained fury. "He stole the seals from a chest I kept locked, or thought I kept locked." The total was significant, not impossible to pay, but enough to destroy the farm's operating capital. If not settled in time, the suppliers could seize guarantees on the cattle and grain stockpile. In less than a month, Greenbone Farm could be reduced to land and timber. "Why are you showing me this?" Dern asked. Helena finally looked up. "Because we could have hidden it. And we didn't." It was that simple. There was no ornament to the statement. It was a fact placed on the table like the candle, to illuminate, not to impress. Dern stared at the numbers for a while. The rain continued. Outside, Ruth's channels were working. He could hear the water running with purpose, guided to where it needed to go, without overflow. "I have the capital to cover this," he said. "What was left after buying the deed is kept at a bank in pale stone." Helena showed no relief. She simply waited. "But I'm not doing it for free," Dern continued. "And I'm not doing it because a paper signed by a liar says I should. I'm doing it as an investment." He straightened his back. "Formal legal partnership, documented by a notary that all of you trust, not one Vance picked, proportional profit sharing, decisions made jointly." "And the companionship clauses?" asked Helena. Her voice was neutral, testing, not accusing. "If it happens," said Dern, It happens because people want it to, not because a piece of paper commands it. He met her gaze. I was never the kind of man who needs a written obligation to treat people decently. The silence lasted. The candle dripped wax onto the table surface. Helena closed the book slowly. I'll wake Ruth and Magdalene. Now? It's midnight. This is a decision for all three of us, she said. It always has been. Dern waited alone. He heard footsteps on the floor above. Low voices in Orc, a guttural language he understood in fragments, enough to catch the tone, not the words. 20 minutes later, the three were in the kitchen. Ruth with her hair loose, her eyes still sleepy but attentive. Magdalene with her braid undone, holding a mug of tea in both hands. Dern repeated the proposal, word for word. Magdalene was the first to respond. Works for me, Ruth nodded, looking at the numbers. Works. Helena remained standing, arms crossed, for a moment longer. Then she opened her hand and extended it over the table. Partnership, she said. Dern shook her hand. It was strong. Of course it was. Everything about her was. The crystal in the doorframe turned gently, with no wind at all. The ride to Pale Stone took 2 days. Dern went with Ruth. Helena had insisted on sending her along, not as a bodyguard, she had made clear, but because Ruth knew the right notary in the city, and which documents needed which seals. Dern hadn't argued. They departed at dawn with rested horses and the sun still low. Ruth was a trail companion, in the best sense of the word. She didn't force conversation, but when she spoke, it was with purpose. On the first day, she explained more about the irrigation system. On the second, they rode in silence for most of the way, each with their own thoughts. At the entrance to Pale Stone, people stared. An Orc woman travelling with a human man was not impossible on the frontiers, but it wasn't common either. Dern was used to being looked at. Years of hunting fugitives had cultivated a certain weariness with other people's opinions. Ruth simply ignored the stares with a calm that seemed practiced from childhood. The bank was in a brick building with an iron door. The manager was an old man with a suspicious mustache who examined Dern's documents with small eyes. He released the capital without major ceremony. The notary Ruth chose operated from a cramped office above a general store. She was a middle-aged Orc woman with glasses too thin for her broad face, who spoke in 3 languages during the consultation without pausing to choose which. The new contract took 4 hours to draft correctly. You review every line, said Ruth, while they waited for the ink to dry. It wasn't a criticism, it was an observation. Learned the hard way, said Dern. So did I. She folded the borrowed reading glasses she always carried in her leather pouch. Vance never read anything. He thought documents were for impressing people, not for committing to them. There are a lot of people like that. More than there should be. She folded the glasses carefully. You're different. I noticed when you checked the account book 3 times before making your proposal. Dern didn't respond immediately. There was something in that observation that was more than a compliment. It was recognition, the kind that comes from someone who also pays attention to what others let slip. The debts were settled by messenger over the following 2 days. Each creditor received full payment with a formal letter of legal responsibility update, signed by Dern with the new contract as an attachment. Magdalene had prepared the list of creditors with precise addresses before they had even departed, as if she had known the answer would be yes. On the ride back to the farm, the sky was clear and the road dry. Ruth pulled her horse closer to Dern's on one of the descents and spoke without looking at him. She won't admit it, said Ruth. But Helena was relieved, in the real way, not the way she shows people. And you? Asked Dern. Ruth thought for a moment. I feel relieved when the numbers add up right. A pause. Today they do. Dern let that settle in the air for a while. The hills ahead had the orange tone of late afternoon, that gold that makes any landscape look better than it really is. When they arrived at the farm, Magdalene was at the fence of the east pasture, fixing a post that had given way in the rain. She waved without stopping her work. There was something uncomplicated in that gesture, the natural acceptance of someone who didn't need ceremony to recognize that things were going well. Dern dismounted and, before thinking, walked over to her. "Can I help?" Magdalene looked at him, then at the post, then at him again. "Hold here." They worked together in silence until the sun disappeared completely. It was the kind of silence that carries no weight. The following week was all paper and negotiation. Dern sent letters to 2 buyers he had met in his frontier years, reliable men who needed quality cattle and paid in gold, not promises. Magdalene reviewed every letter before it was sent, suggesting changes in tone and terms with a precision that Dern admired without comment. Ruth spent the week expanding the farm map to include a new sector to the northwest that she had set aside for lack of manpower. With Dern available to haul stones and level ground, work that would have taken a month was done in 9 days. Helena coordinated everything from an overview she rarely put into words, but that was present in every small decision. Which field to plant first? When to move the cattle? How to distribute the 4 people's time so that no area was neglected? It was a logistical intelligence that operated in silence, like the current of a deep river. On a Wednesday afternoon, while Dern repaired the barn roof, Helena climbed the ladder and sat on the edge of the rooftop without being called. She looked out at the fields for a time, without speaking. "When Vance left," she said finally, "I went a week without sleeping properly, not from sadness, from anger at my own lack of judgment." Dern kept nailing a plank. That wasn't a lack of judgment. That was trusting someone who lied. "It's the same thing in the result." "It's not." He stopped. "Lack of judgment is when you see the signs and ignore them because you want to believe. Trusting is when the signs aren't there yet." Helena was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am." He went back to the hammer. "I learned the difference the hard way too." She didn't ask more, but she stayed on the rooftop for another half hour. And when she climbed down, it was with something lighter in her shoulders, imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. 3 weeks after the contract was signed, the first payment from the new buyers arrived in pale stone. It was more than Magdalene had projected in her conservative estimate. She looked at the figure written on the receipt, looked at Dern, and then at the ceiling. "It worked," she said, as if still processing. "That was the plan," said Dern. "Plans don't always work. This one worked because the roots already existed. I just opened more doors." Magdalene folded the receipt carefully and stored it in the newest notebook. There was a disciplined pleasure in that gesture, the satisfaction of someone who worked toward a result and knows exactly what it cost. That evening, the 4 people sat at the table with a better dinner than usual. Helena had hunted a deer in the morning. Ruth had made bread with grain from their own field. Magdalene had opened a bottle of dark wine she had been keeping for the right occasion, without specifying which one. No one made a speech. No one needed to. The crystal in the doorframe turned 3 times in a row at the start of dinner, without any wind. Dern watched it. Helena watched it too, and her eyes went to his for a second. "You see it?" she said quietly. "I see it," he confirmed. "I'll explain what it means later." Dern nodded. Later. There was time. Winter arrived with frosts that whitened the fields before sunrise and melted before noon, a young cold that tested without killing. Greenbone Farm passed through the season with full stockpiles and cattle sheltered in barns that Ruth had reinforced with extra timber in the fall, as if she had known what was coming. The 3 months since the contract signing had changed the farm in ways that Dern sometimes paused to take stock of. Production had grown with the new northwest sector in operation. The trade agreements now covered 4 settlements. The Orc healer to the west had referred the farm to an even more distant community that needed grain. The cattle herd had increased in number and in average health. But what had changed most was not in Magdalen's notebooks. With Helena, a quiet complicity had developed that he couldn't name for a long time. She consulted him before major decisions, not because the contract required it, but because she had discovered that Dern saw angles she missed, and vice versa. On one cold afternoon, sitting over expansion maps for the next season, she had placed her hand over his for a second, not as an intentional gesture, just the natural contact of 2 bodies that had learned to trust each other. Dern hadn't moved. Neither had she. With Ruth, the connection was harder to describe. It had come slowly, like water seeping through stone. She had begun to show him the smaller details of the irrigation system, the things not on the map, the intuitions she had developed about the behavior of water on that specific terrain. It was the kind of knowledge shared with very few people. Dern had recognized this and treated it with the corresponding care. With Magdalen, it had been different, fast and unexpected, like most things she did. They had been fixing the fence of the east sector on a windy day, working back-to-back for hours, when she had turned suddenly and said, with no apparent context, "You're a good person, Ashvale." And the way she had said it, direct, without ornament, was the kind of statement that lands deeper than any elaborate praise. Dern had stayed quiet a second too long. She had laughed, a short, honest laugh, and gone back to the fence. On that winter evening, with the 4 of them inside and the frost outside, Helena lit 3 candles in the center of the table and took the crystal down from the door. "You want to know what this amulet means," she said. It was not a question. "For a while now," admitted Dern. Helena placed the crystal in the center of the table, between the candles. In their light, the dark green gained depth, like looking into a stone that had space inside it. "Echo crystals," said Helena. "Shamans of the Greystone clan make them. They don't predict the future. They record patterns. If an ancient spirit passed through a place before, the crystal recognizes when a similar pattern forms again." Dern looked at the crystal. "And what has it recorded here?" "That this farm was a true home once, long ago," said Helena, "and that it can become one again." She met his gaze. "When you arrived, it began to turn. It turned when Vance was here too, but in the wrong direction." Dern stared at the crystal for a long moment. The memory he had been pushing down since the first night came back slowly, without rush. That southern town, that winter. The crystal he had seen in the window of an Orc healer, turning in the wrong direction the day before everything went wrong. He had spent 5 years trying to understand what had failed that day. Perhaps the crystal had simply known before he did. "Thank you for explaining," he said. Helena put the crystal back. "Thank you for staying." Spring came early that year. The first flowers appeared along the edges of Ruth's channels, while winter was still lingering, small, white, stubborn, and within 2 weeks had spread across the entire field like a decision reached together. The farm woke with them. The new trade agreements were in full effect. The 5th settlement had joined Magdalen's route after a negotiation she had conducted personally, traveling 2 days and returning with a better contract than expected and a courtesy gift for each partner, rare herbs from the north that the community grew in excess. Magdalen had distributed the gifts at the next dinner without ceremony, the way someone passes the salt. Ruth had finished the expansion of the irrigation system into the new sector. It worked better than the original model because she had incorporated what she had learned about the behavior of water on that specific terrain through the winter. Dern had watched the first test of the complete system standing beside her and had seen, for a few seconds, something rare on Ruth's face, pure satisfaction with no reservation at all. Helena had negotiated with a neighboring Orc clan the purchase of 3 head of a cold, hardier cattle breed, expanding the herd with careful judgment. The clan had sent an elder as representative, an old Orc with ritual scars on his face and eyes that calculated everything in silence. He had examined the farm for 2 days, eaten at the table with all 4 people, and before departing had said something in guttural Orc that Helena had translated afterward without drama. He said, "The land here is satisfied." On a clear, sunny afternoon, Dern was out in the field when a traveller stopped at the fence with a worn hat and a face he didn't immediately recognize. The man asked for water and food in exchange for work. Dern evaluated him for a moment, the quick assessment that years on the frontier had refined in him, and said yes. The traveller worked the full day, honestly, and left at nightfall with a meal tin and a handshake. Magdalene, who had watched the interaction from the porch, waited for the man to disappear before she commented. "You trusted him quickly." "I could see he was sincere," said Dern. "How?" He thought for a moment. "Eyes don't wander when people say what's true. They wander when they're building a version." Magdalene was quiet for a second. "I learned the same thing. Just took me longer." That evening, the 4 sat on the porch with the clear sky above the canyon of green shadows, a spectacle of stars that only appeared like that on cloudless, moonless nights. Helena had brought a bottle of wild honey mead that the clan elder had left as a gift. Ruth had found 4 matching cups, which none of them mentioned, but all of them noticed. Someone asked Dern if he had any regrets. It was Magdalene, in the casual voice of someone asking sideways. He thought honestly. There were things that could have been done differently. The proposal could have been made sooner, saving a few weeks of tension. The ride to the bank could have been faster if he had known about the debts earlier. "Just one," he said. "Which?" asked Helena, not arriving sooner. The silence that followed was the good kind, dense with satisfaction, not discomfort. Ruth drank the mead slowly. Magdalene looked at the stars. Helena kept her eyes on the crystal, which she had placed on a shelf on the porch, and which turned now with steady softness in the right direction. Dern looked at it too. He thought of the clan elder, of the phrase Helena had translated. "The land here is satisfied." He understood what that meant now. It wasn't about the land. Far away, beyond the northern hills, a light crossed the sky. Fast. Green, leaving no trail. Dern caught it from the corner of his eye but said nothing. Helena saw it too. He knew because she paused her cup halfway to her mouth for exactly 1 second. Then she kept drinking. There were things the canyon of green shadows kept that needed no words yet. Perhaps one day. Perhaps when the crystal indicated it was time. For now, the farm was alive. The fields were in bloom, and the porch held the weight of 4 people who had each learned in their own way that trust built slowly is the only kind that lasts. The wind passed through them and moved on toward the north.